It was past midnight, and as I stood outside Dylan's apartment, staring at the light bleeding through the curtains, I could feel the heat rising up my neck. Clarice had said she was working late, but here I was 2 days earlier than expected from my trip, and something in my gut told me this wasn't about politics or work. It was something far worse. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling just a bit, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I heard muffled voices and footsteps approaching the door. The knob turned slowly, and there she was, Clarice, wrapped in a towel, her face flushed as though she'd just gotten out of a hot shower. Behind her stood Dylan, my own brother. I could feel my body tense up, fists clenching, breath quickening as the reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. I'd been suspicious for a while now. The late nights, the lack of affection, the way she laughed at texts she tried to hide, all those clues, and still, nothing prepared me for this. For the past few months, Clarice had been distant. Not in the way couples grow apart slowly over time, but in sharp, unmistakable cuts that I could feel deep in my chest. She'd stopped talking about her day, stopped caring when I did something thoughtful, and more noticeably, she had stopped wanting to be close. We had a comfortable life. I worked as a contractor, long hours but good pay. Clarice had a promising career in politics, and between the two of us, we had built something that I thought was solid, but it was all crumbling. There was one moment that had stayed with me, like a stone lodged in my heart. I remember one night sitting at the dinner table after the kids had gone to bed. Clarice was on her phone, typing rapidly, smiling at something on the screen. I asked her who it was, but she dismissed me with a quick, "Just work stuff." The next day, she had forgotten her phone at home. That should have been my first big clue. Her constant companion, her lifeline to the world, left behind as if by accident. When it buzzed with a message, I couldn't help myself. It was from Dylan. "Can't wait to see you tonight." Aimed. My stomach dropped. But I convinced myself it was innocent, that maybe they were planning something for my birthday next month. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overreacting, but the doubts never left. And fleft. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though every part of me wanted to shout. Clarice stared at me, her eyes wide, searching for something to say. Anything that might save her from this moment. Dylan shifted awkwardly behind her, his shirt half-buttoned, his hair messy. There was no denying what I had walked into. "Eon, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "No? Then what is it?" I stepped forward, my anger rising to the surface. My mind was screaming, begging me to turn and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know how deep this betrayal went. I needed to hear her say it. Clarice's voice faltered. She didn't need to finish. Her face said everything. I turned to Dylan, my younger brother, the one person I'd always trusted. He had been the wild one, the charmer who could talk his way out of anything. But family was supposed to be sacred. This was unforgivable. "You're my brother," I growled, taking a step closer to him. "How could you do this to me?" Dylan opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. I wanted to punch him, feel the bones in his face break under the force of my fist, but something held me back. My kids, maybe. Or maybe it was the last shred of humanity I had left. "Ian, please, let's talk about this," Clarice pleaded, stepping between us, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow erase the scene unfolding in front of me. But I was done talking. And without another word, I turned and walked out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I stumbled down the stairs, each step taking me further away from the life I thought I knew. The next day was a blur. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together how I had missed the signs. How had things gotten this far? Clarice had always been ambitious, driven, but I had never imagined she'd be capable of something like this. And Dylan, my own brother, how could he betray me like that? I decided then and there I was done. There would be no reconciliation, no second chances. Clarice had made her choice, and so had Dylan. The next time I saw either of them would be in a lawyer's office. But first, I had to protect my kids. I wouldn't let them get caught in the middle of this mess. Clarice could burn her career to the ground if she wanted, but I would make sure the kids were far away from the fallout. I went home the next day, packed a few bags, and made arrangements to move out. The kids didn't need to know the details yet. All they needed to know was that we were leaving for a while, just until things calmed down. As I drove away from the house, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. Clarice's car was in the driveway, but she didn't come out to stop me. She didn't fight for us. That hurt more than anything. A few days later, just as I was starting to get a handle on things, I got a call from a friend. "Have you seen the news?" I hadn't. I wasn't interested in anything outside of keeping my kids safe. But when I turned on the TV, there it was. Clarice's face splashed across the screen, next to a grainy video of her and Dylan in bed together. The scandal broke hard and fast. Claris's career was over in an instant, and the world was finally seeing her for what she really was. I should have felt vindicated, but all I felt was empty. I had lost everything. The morning after the scandal hit, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from reporters, friends, family, all wanting to know the same thing. How did I not see this coming? How long had it been going on? But I couldn't answer them. I barely understood it myself. The news was everywhere. Claris had been exposed, not just for cheating, but for doing so with my own brother, Dylan. The video was played on every network, every gossip site, turning a family betrayal into a public spectacle. There was no escaping it. Even my kids, tucked away at my parents' house for now, couldn't avoid the whispers and looks. Claris tried to call me that morning. I didn't answer. What could she possibly say? Sorry. That was meaningless now. I wasn't interested in apologies, explanations, or any half-hearted attempts to justify what she had done. She had burned our life to the ground. Nothing she could say would fix that. By midday, I found myself outside Dylan's apartment again. I hadn't planned on coming here, but I needed to see him. I needed to understand why he, of all people, had done this to me. When he opened the door, he looked like hell unshaven, eyes bloodshot, probably from a night of drinking or guilt. He didn't say anything as he stepped aside to let me in. Maybe he knew what was coming. The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a storm. I wanted to hit him, throw him against the wall, and make him feel every ounce of betrayal I had felt. But instead, I stood there staring at the man who had once been my best friend. My little brother. How long? I asked, my voice cold, barely above a whisper. Dylan looked at the floor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. It wasn't supposed to happen, Ian. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I could feel the anger bubbling up again, threatening to boil over. How long? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. A year, maybe longer. I don't know when it started exactly. It just happened. A year? I repeated, the weight of his words crushing me. A whole year of lies right under my nose. And you didn't think to stop. You didn't think about me, about your family? It wasn't like that, he said, his voice defensive now. Claris, she wasn't happy, Ian. She said you weren't around enough, that you didn't care. I snapped then. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. You were just what? Helping her? You think sleeping with my wife was doing me a favor? Dylan didn't fight back. He just stood there, taking it, maybe knowing he deserved it. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ian. You didn't mean to hurt me? I released him, stepping back in disgust. You betrayed me. You slept with my wife. Don't stand there and act like you're the victim here. I know, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes still downcast. I messed up. I know that. I wanted to yell, to hit him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused. But standing there, looking at him, all I felt was a deep, crushing sadness. He wasn't worth it. Not anymore. Stay away from me. Stay away from my kids, I said, my voice hoarse from the anger I'd been holding back. You're dead to me, Dylan. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. The sound echoed through the hallway, but it didn't bring me any satisfaction. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, painful conversations, and cold, empty nights. I had filed for divorce within days of the scandal breaking. I didn't need time to think it over. Claris had made her choice and I was making mine. Our lawyer meetings were tense and awkward. Claris tried to talk to me, tried to apologize, but I kept everything strictly professional. The kids needed stability, and that was my priority now. She could say whatever she wanted, but I wasn't listening anymore. The media hounded us for weeks. Paparazzi camped outside my house, flashing their cameras when I stepped out, so the tabloids ran headline after headline, each more salacious than the last. Betrayed brother speaks out. The political scandal rocks the city. Anchor Breeze balks the city. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the effect it had on the kids. My son, Ben, was only 10, old enough to know something was wrong, but too young to fully understand. He kept asking why his mom wasn't coming home, why she was on the news. My daughter, Grace, barely spoke at all. She just stayed in her room, headphones on, trying to drown out the world. They were the ones who would suffer the most. Not Claris, not Dylan. Them. And that was what I hated the most about all of this. Claris, once the rising star of the political world, was now a pariah. The scandal had destroyed her career overnight. Sponsors pulled their support, her party distanced themselves, and every event she was booked for was quietly canceled. The video had leaked from an anonymous source, someone who had clearly been in the right place at the wrong time. It showed her and Dylan in bed together, laughing, kissing, completely unaware they were being filmed. The video was grainy, but there was no mistaking it was them. At first, she tried to deny it. She went on the news claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that it had been taken out of context, but the evidence was undeniable. When the public turned on her, she crumbled. I watched from a distance as she tried to salvage what was left of her life. She gave tearful interviews apologizing to her supporters, to her colleagues, to me, but no one cared. In politics, forgiveness is a luxury no one can afford. By the time the divorce was finalized, Clarice had lost everything: her career, her reputation, and most importantly, her family. She tried to fight for joint custody, but the court ruled in my favor. The video had sealed her fate. The kids were better off with me. It took time to heal, if you could even call it that. Moving to a new city with the kids was the only option. I needed to get away from the reminders, the whispers, the constant barrage of painful memories that haunted me every time I drove by a place we'd been together. The kids were resilient. They adapted faster than I did, making new friends, adjusting to a new school. But I knew the scars of what had happened would stay with them forever, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. I, on the other hand, wasn't sure how to move forward. Every time I thought about dating again, my mind went back to Clarice and Dylan. Trust felt impossible now. The idea of letting someone into my life, my kids' lives, seemed like a risk I wasn't willing to take. But life went on. I had to keep moving for the sake of the kids. They needed me now more than ever, and I wasn't going to let them down. Just when I thought things were finally settling down, just as the dust was beginning to clear, I got a text. It was from a number I didn't recognize. "Ian, it's Clarice. We need to talk. It's important." For a moment, I considered ignoring it, deleting it, pretending I had never seen it. But something in the back of my mind told me this wasn't over yet. Well, what could she possibly have to say? So I stared at the text for what felt like hours, my mind racing with possibilities. But why would Clarice want to talk now? We were divorced, her career was in shambles, and our lives were as separate as they could be. But this wasn't just some casual message. It's important, she had said. I didn't know what could be more important than the destruction of everything we had once built. What was left for us to talk about? Against my better judgment, I texted back, "What do you want?" Her response came almost immediately. "It's about Dylan. Please, can we meet?" Dylan, of course it was about him. Even now, he was still at the center of everything that had gone wrong. I hadn't spoken to him since the confrontation in his apartment, and I had no intention of ever speaking to him again. He had become a ghost in my life, a painful memory I kept buried deep. I debated whether to even respond. After everything she had done, did she deserve another minute of my time? But curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what was so urgent that she would reach out after months of silence. We agreed to meet at a small diner on the edge of town, somewhere away from prying eyes. And when I arrived, Clarice was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, staring out at the parking lot. She looked worn down, her once perfectly styled hair now disheveled, and the confident, powerful woman I had known was gone. In her place was someone who seemed almost broken. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to walk out and pretend I'd never come. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. Clarice looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in her in a long time: fear. "Ian," she said softly, her voice trembling, "thanks for coming." "I'm not here for you," I replied coldly, sliding into the seat across from her. "You said this was about Dylan? What is it?" She bit her lip, glancing around nervously before leaning in closer, lowering her voice. "Dylan's in trouble, serious trouble." I couldn't help but scoff. "He's been in trouble for months." "Clarice, you both ruined everything. What more could there possibly be?" "This isn't about us," she said, her voice growing more desperate. "I know I've hurt you, and I know there's nothing I can say to make that better. But Dylan, he's gotten involved with some dangerous people." "Dangerous people?" I frowned. This wasn't what I was expecting. "What the hell are you talking about?"
She hesitated, wringing her hands together. After the scandal, Dylan lost everything: his job, his friends, his reputation. He started drinking, gambling. He owed a lot of money to some very bad people. At first, I thought he could handle it, but it's gotten worse. They've been threatening him, Ian. And now, they're threatening me.
I felt a cold wave wash over me. I didn't care about Dylan's mess, but the idea of him dragging Clarice into it, and by extension, my kids, that was a different story. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice hardening. "What can I do?" "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes welling up with tears. I don't know where else to turn. And I thought maybe you could talk to him, try to help him." "Help him?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "After what he did? After what you did? Why would I ever want to help him?" Clarice flinched at my words, but she didn't back down. "Because he's your brother, Ian, and despite everything, he's still family. I don't expect you to forgive him or me, but I'm scared. They showed up at my house last night, banging on the door, saying they were going to hurt us if Dylan didn't pay what he owed. They mentioned the kids, Ian. Our kids. That was all it took." Hearing her mention Ben and Grace snapped something inside me. Whatever hatred I had for Dylan, Whatever anger still simmered toward Clarice, it paled in comparison to the protective instinct I had for my children. Perp, if these people were threatening them, then I had no choice but to get involved. Where is he? I asked through gritted teeth. Clarice told me Dylan had been staying at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where you paid by the hour, not the night, and the people who stayed there usually didn't want to be found. I didn't tell Clarice what I planned to do when I found him. I wasn't even sure myself, but I had to see him. I had to hear from him what kind of mess he had gotten us all into. When I arrived at the motel, I could see why Dylan had chosen it. It was the perfect place to disappear. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly glow over the cracked pavement. I parked my car and made my way to the room Clarice had mentioned. I knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open just enough for Dylan to peer out. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, and he smelled like a mix of sweat and cheap booze. "What do you want?" He slurred, barely able to keep his balance. I shoved the door open and stepped inside, pushing him back. "We need to talk." Dylan stumbled back onto the bed, rubbing his face as if trying to clear the fog from his mind. "About what?" "There's nothing left to talk about. Clarice says people are threatening her and the kids because of you," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Is that true?"
He groaned, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could handle it."
"Handle what?" I snapped. "What the hell did you get yourself into?" Dylan sighed heavily, reaching for a bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. I knocked it out of his hand before he could take a drink. He looked up at me, defeated. "I owe some money. A lot of money. I've been gambling, and I can't pay them back." "Who's them?" I asked. But I already knew it wasn't some friendly neighborhood poker game he was talking about. A guy named Navarro. He runs a gambling ring. I borrowed some money from him to pay off a debt, and it spiraled from there. Now I owe him more than I can ever pay back. I clenched my fists, trying to control the rage boiling inside me. "And now they're threatening Clarice and the kids." Dylan nodded miserably. "They said if I don't pay up soon, they'll come after them." I wanted to hit him, knock some sense into him, but that wouldn't solve anything. "You're a fucking idiot, you know that." "So yeah," he muttered. "I know." I left Dylan's motel room, more pissed off than when I'd arrived. This wasn't my problem, none of it was. But now, because of Dylan's stupidity, my family was in danger. As much as I wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing, I couldn't, not while Ben and Grace were caught in the middle. I drove back to my house, my mind racing. There was no way I could fix this on my own, but I knew someone who might be able to help. I hadn't spoken to an old friend of mine, Will, in years. We had grown up together, gotten into plenty of trouble as kids, but after high school, we went our separate ways. Will had gone into law enforcement. He wasn't a cop. Exactly, more of a fixer. The kind of guy you called when you needed something to disappear quietly. It wasn't a call I wanted to make, but I didn't see any other option. If Dylan had gotten mixed up with someone like Navarro, then this wasn't going to end with a simple apology and a check. I picked up the phone and dialed Will's number. After a few rings, he answered, his voice gruff but familiar. "Ian? Haven't heard from you in a long time, man." "Yeah, it's been a while," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Listen, I've got a situation, and I need your help." So there was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves some bad people threatening my family because my brother owes them money." Will was silent for a moment, and I could practically hear him thinking. "All right," he said finally. "Now let's meet. You can tell me everything." That night, I sat in my car outside the diner waiting for Will to show up. My mind was a mess, torn between the past and the present. Everything that had happened, the betrayal, the scandal, the divorce, it had all led to this moment. But now I was stepping into something darker, something I wasn't sure I could control. I knew once I got involved with Will, there would be no turning back. Things would get messy. As I sat there, the screen of my phone lit up with a message. It was from Clarice. "Ian, please be careful. There's something I didn't tell you. It's worse than you think." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting in knots. What could possibly be worse than this? What else was she hiding? And then I saw Will's car pull up. The real trouble was about to begin. Will's car rolled to a stop in the diner's parking lot, the familiar black sedan blending in under the flickering streetlights. I watched him step out, looking just like I remembered, grizzled, calm, and with that unreadable expression he always wore when things were about to get serious. I took a deep breath and got out of my car, feeling the tension twist through my body as I approached him. This wasn't just about Dylan anymore. Something about Clarice's last message had me on edge, and it wasn't just the usual paranoia. It's worse than you think. I didn't know what she meant, but I was going to find out. "Been a long time," Ian, Will said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, steady. "Guess you wouldn't be calling me unless things were bad." "They're bad," I admitted, gesturing toward the diner. "Let's talk inside." We slid into a booth in the back of the diner, away from the few late-night customers and the waitress who looked more interested in her phone than in us. The place smelled of stale coffee and fried food, but it was quiet. That's all I needed right now, quiet and answers. So Will said, leaning back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, "Tell me what's going on." I laid it all out for him: Dylan's debts, the threats against Clarice and the kids, the people he owed money to. I told him about Navarro, the gambling ring, and how Dylan had spiraled into this mess. Will didn't say much, just nodded here and there, taking it all in. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "This Navarro guy, he's serious. I've heard of him, he doesn't play around. But you don't pay him back, he doesn't just come for you. He comes for everyone you care about." That confirmed my worst fear. "What do we do? I'm not asking you to make this go away, but I need to protect my family. The kids can't be in danger because of Dylan's stupidity." Will scratched his chin, thinking it over. "You need to cut ties with your brothers. First off, no matter how this goes down, Dylan's in too deep. There's no pulling him out of this without a fight." "I've already cut ties," I said, my jaw tightening. "I haven't spoken to him since, well, but now Clarice is involved." "The kids," Will nodded slowly. "You said they came to Clarice's house? Made threats?" "Yeah," she said. "They mentioned the kids by name." "That's bad," Will muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Real bad. Can you help?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "I don't know what to do, Will. I'm not a cop. I can't handle guys like Navarro." Will leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I can help, but it's going to cost you." I frowned. "How much?" "Not money," he said, shaking his head. "You'll owe me a favor. One day when I need something, you do it. No questions." I should have hesitated. I should have asked what kind of favor he meant. But the image of Ben and Grace flashed through my mind, my kids, innocent in all this. I didn't have a choice. "All right," I said, nodding. "Whatever it takes."
Will leaned back, satisfied. "Good. First thing we need to do is get your family out of the line of fire. I know a place, a safe house, off the grid. You take Clarice and the kids there until I figure out how to handle Navarro."
"Clarice too?" I asked, surprised. The thought of being stuck in the same house with her after everything she'd done made my stomach churn. "You don't have a choice," Will said firmly. "If she's on Navarro's radar, you keep her close. So I'll arrange for someone to keep an eye on her, make sure she doesn't bolt. But the kids need her, Ian." So I knew he was right. No matter how much I hated what Clarice had done, she was still their mother. And in this twisted mess, I couldn't risk her getting hurt or worse while I tried to figure this out. By the time I called Clarice and told her to pack up the kids, the dread had settled deep in my bones. This wasn't just about keeping them safe. It was about locking myself into a situation where I had no control, trusting Will with more than I wanted to. Clarice picked up on the second ring, her voice shaky but relieved when I explained what was happening. "Ian, thank you," she whispered. I didn't know what else to do. "I'm so scared." I wasn't doing it for her, but I didn't say that. "Just get the kids ready. I'll pick you up in an hour." An hour later, I pulled up outside the house. Clarice was waiting at the door with Ben and Grace, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, eyes wide with confusion. Clarice looked just as fragile as she had at the diner, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she helped the kids into the car. "You're going to explain all this to me later," I told her as we drove away. "I want to know everything, every single detail you've left out." "I will," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, Ian, I'll tell you everything." The safe house was tucked away in the woods, far enough from the city to feel like we were stepping into another world. It was a small, nondescript cabin, just 2 bedrooms and a living room, with an ancient fireplace that smelled like it hadn't been used in years. But it was quiet, safe, and right now that's all that mattered. Will had been true to his word. When we arrived, there was a man waiting, one of his guys, a burly ex-military type, who didn't say much but gave off the vibe that he'd been through hell and back. He introduced himself as Mason and told me he'd be keeping an eye on things from the guest house nearby. "I don't worry about a thing," Mason said, his voice deep and calm. "Nobody's getting near this place without me knowing." It was a small comfort, but I nodded anyway. The kids went to bed shortly after we arrived, exhausted from the chaos of the day. Clarice and I stayed up, sitting in tense silence in the living room. The only sound the crackling of the fire Mason had built before heading out. "Ian," Clarice started, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for everything, for what I did to you, for Dylan." I didn't respond right away, my eyes fixed on the flames. I had spent months drowning in my anger and betrayal, but now, sitting here in this cabin with everything crumbling around us, I didn't have the energy to hate her anymore. "What's worse than Navarro?" I asked finally, turning to face her. "You said it was worse than I think. What did you mean?" Clarice took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "There's something you don't know about Dylan," she whispered. "Something I've been hiding from you since the iftar started." My heart sank. I didn't want to hear it. Whatever it was, I knew it was going to rip open wounds that had barely started to heal, but I had to know.
"What is it?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended.
Clarice's hands trembled as she spoke. Dylan wasn't just gambling. He was working for Navarro, but he was helping him smuggle drugs, Ian. That's how it all started. That's how he got in so deep. I didn't know at first, but once I found out, it was too late. He was already trapped. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Drugs, smuggling. Dylan wasn't just some idiot gambler who couldn't pay his debts. He was involved in something far more dangerous. And Clarice had known. She had known this whole time and said nothing. "You kept this from me?" I asked, my voice shaking with fury. "You knew he was in with Navarro? And you didn't tell me?" I was scared. She cried, tears streaming down her face. "I thought if I told you, it would make things worse. I didn't know what to do, Ian. I didn't want to drag you into it."
"You already dragged me into it," I shouted, standing up, pacing in front of the fireplace. "You dragged me, the kids, everyone into this."
Clarice sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I stood there, fists clenched, trying to breathe through the storm of emotions swirling inside me. There was so much I wanted to say, so much anger and betrayal and pain, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was how deep we were in this now, how dangerous it had become. And I realized in that moment that there was no way out of this without blood being spilled. Just as the tension between us reached its breaking point, there was a knock at the door. It froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Mason had said nobody would get near the house without him knowing, but here we were in the middle of nowhere, and someone was at the door. Clarice looked up, her face pale with fear. Who could face be? I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and moved toward the door, motioning for Clarice to stay back. The knock came again, louder this time. I glanced through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. It was Dylan. And he wasn't alone. Dylan stood at the door, looking worse than the last time I'd seen him, as if he'd aged 10 years in a few days. But it wasn't just him that made my blood run cold. Standing next to him, hands stuffed into the pockets of a leather jacket, was a man I didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm menace radiating from him. I didn't need to ask to know who he was. Navarro. For a moment, I froze, the iron poker clutched in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear Clarice's sharp intake of breath as she realized who was at the door. Mason was supposed to be watching the house, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen. Something had gone terribly wrong. The knock came again, harder this time. "Ian?" Dylan called from the other side, his voice shaky. "Open the door. We need to talk." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I was trapped. My kids were upstairs asleep and Clarice was standing just feet away, looking like she might collapse from fear. I didn't have time to think, only to act. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and swung it open, gripping the poker tightly in my hand. Dylan's eyes flickered to the weapon but said nothing. Navarro's cold gaze, however, lingered on me, taking in the scene with a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "Ian," Dylan started, his voice strained. "I didn't want it to come to this." I stepped aside, letting them in. "What's this? Why are you here?" Navarro walked in like he owned the place, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me with a slow, deliberate smile. "Family reunions," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Always come at the most inconvenient times, don't they?" I stayed silent, watching every move he made, every twitch of his hands. This was a man used to having power, used to getting what he wanted. And right now, what he wanted was something far more than money. "Dylan owes me," Navarro said, turning to face me fully. "But this isn't just about debt anymore." "I'll pay you," I said quickly, my mind scrambling for a way out. "I'll get the money. Just leave my family out of this." Navarro chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not that simple, Ian. Your brother made promises he couldn't keep, and now you're all part of the equation." I looked at Dylan, who couldn't meet my gaze. "What the hell does he mean?" Dylan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to pay him back, Ian, I swear. But I didn't have enough, and Navarro gave me another way to clear the debt." My stomach dropped. "What did you do?" Navarro stepped in, answering for him. "Dylan here agreed to help move product for me, but he got sloppy, made mistakes, and now the feds are breathing down my neck. That's why I'm here. Your brother's not just in debt, he's a liability." I felt the room spinning, my mind trying to process the enormity of what was happening. Dylan hadn't just gotten in over his head, he'd dragged us all into something far more dangerous than gambling debts. "Ian," Dylan said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it would get this bad. I thought I could handle it, but now they're threatening you, the kids, Clarice." I gripped the poker tighter, the rage boiling up inside me. "So what now?" I spat, turning to Navarro. "You kill us? Make an example out of my family?" So Navarro's smirk never wavered. "I don't kill families, Ian, but I do settle debts." And right now, Dylan's debt is more than just money. There was a long pause, tension filling the room like a ticking bomb. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't hurt the kids. You can take me. Do whatever you want to me." Just leave them out of this. Navarro's gaze flickered to her, his smile widening just a bit. Noble, but unnecessary. He turned back to me, his expression hardening. You're going to help me, Ian. You're going to make this all go away. What do you mean? I asked, my voice tight with anger. Navarro shrugged. The feds are watching my operation, thanks to your brother's incompetence. I need someone to take the fall, to make sure they look the other way while I clean house. I realized in that moment what he was asking. He wanted me to turn myself in, to take the blame for Dylan's crimes. You're insane, I said, shaking my head. I won't do it. You will, Navarro said calmly, stepping closer. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone you care about pays the price. Dylan's already screwed. He's mine whether he knows it or not. But you still have something to lose. Your kids, your ex-wife. Do you really want them caught up in this? I could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his threat crushing me. If I refused, my family would never be safe. But if I agreed, I would be throwing my life away. I glanced at Dylan, hoping for some kind of solution, some sign that he had a plan. But he just stood there, his shoulders slumped, defeated. There was no way out, no escape. Ian, Clarice whispered, her voice desperate. Don't. Please. We'll find another way. But there wasn't another way. Not anymore. Navarro had made sure of that. I stared at the man standing in front of me, the weight of his offer pressing down on me like 1,000 tons. Could I really do it? Could I really take the fall for my brother's crimes, knowing I'd be throwing away my life, leaving my kids without a father? But what choice did I have? If I refused, they would come after Ben and Grace, and that was something I couldn't live with. I'll do it, I said finally, my voice hollow. I'll take the fall. Clarice gasped, stepping forward. Ian, no, you can't. I have to, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. It's the only way to keep you and the kids safe. Navarro smiled, satisfied. Good choice. What happens now? I asked, already feeling the weight of the decision settling in. Navarro shrugged casually. I'll have my lawyer contact you. We'll work out the details. All you have to do is confess to the feds. Tell them it was you running the operation. They'll believe you. You've got no priors, no record. You'll serve a few years, maybe less if you cooperate. A few years. It sounded like a lifetime, but I nodded, knowing I had no other option. Navarro and Dylan left shortly after, leaving Clarice and me alone in the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light over the room. I could barely process what had just happened, the enormity of what I had agreed to. Ian? Clarice said softly, tears streaming down her face. You can't do this. We'll figure something out. We'll run, we'll hide anything but this. I shook my head. Running won't solve anything. Navarro will find us. And the kids, they'll never be safe. She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I did this, she whispered. I brought this into our lives. If it weren't for me, for Dylan. Stop, I said gently, sitting beside her. This isn't about blame anymore. It's about survival. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of the decision hanging over us. In the morning, I would leave. I would turn myself in, and that would be the end of it. Clarice eventually fell asleep, her head resting against my shoulder, her body shaking with quiet sobs. I stayed awake, staring into the dying embers, wondering what my life would be like once I was gone. So the next morning, I kissed my kids goodbye, telling them I had to leave for a while, but I would be back. They didn't ask questions, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew something was wrong, but they trusted me. I didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. Claire stood in the doorway, watching as I walked to my car. I'll make sure they're safe, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll protect them. I promise. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. There was nothing left to say. As I drove away, the sun rising over the horizon, I felt the weight of everything settling on my shoulders. I had made my choice. I had sacrificed myself to protect my family, and now there was no going back. Months passed, and the trial went as expected. I confessed, took the fall for Dylan's crimes, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. With good behavior, I might get out sooner, but it didn't matter. Navarro kept his word. My family was left alone. Dylan, as far as I knew, had disappeared. I didn't care where he was. He was dead to me now. Clarice visited me a few times, bringing the kids with her. They were growing up fast, and I hated that I was missing it. But seeing them safe, seeing them smile, it was enough to keep me going. As I sat in my cell, staring at the 4 gray walls surrounding me, I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the betrayal, the lies, the choices that had destroyed everything I once had.
But in the end, it didn't matter. I had protected my family, and that was all that mattered.